Hi, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Right, thank you. I'm having a technical issue. Let me get, okay, there we go. All right, thank you for joining the Caney Creek Linnville Bayou Watershed public meeting tonight. Tonight, we're going to discuss the plan to reduce high concentrations of bacteria in Caney Creek and Linnville Bayou Watershed. Stephen Johnston will be your presenter, and Andrea Tantillo and I will help moderate the group tonight. If you have any questions during the meeting, you can raise your hand. You can see that on the list of attendees, or you can type a quick note in the chat. Then following the presentation, we're going to have plenty of time for discussion. So I'd like to turn it over to Stephen Johnston right now to give us our presentation.
All right, thank you, Andrea. As I can't see how many folks are on, I'll apologize for technical issues that might happen as we kind of transition into this sort of electronic meeting process. So I can tell you right off the bat that there will probably be glitches either in this meeting or in efforts to do this going down the road. Happy St. Patrick's Day, by the way. So we are going to talk about the Caney Creek Total Maximum Daily Load project. Andrea, can you get a sense of who all's on? Because there are parts where I can probably speed through if everybody has seen a lot of the previous meeting slides. Just want to get an idea.
Sure, we have, and you just told me how to pronounce his name, Jason
Leifester.
Leifester from TCEQ, Colleen Rocco from Parks and Wildlife. We have Wendy Almanzon from H-GAC and John McLaughlin from the Watershed.
Okay, so I think outside of Wendy, we probably have covered most. So there'll probably be a few slides where I might go through pretty quickly, just because I know most of you are familiar with the background of the project. But do raise your hand if there's a question or you have a thought or comment. As such a small group, I don't think there'll be a problem in taking questions throughout the presentation rather than waiting to the end. So let's go ahead and proceed. So tonight's agenda, we did the welcome opening. We will focus on a really short, quick project review focused on the TMDL, Total Maximum Daily Load process. But really we want to focus tonight on the second part, which is discuss draft management measures and review those with you and hopefully get feedback on them. That's really the goal tonight. We need that to kind of help populate the implementation plan that we're trying to get drafted and through TCEQ. The next thing would be to discuss the watershed protection plan, and I'd hope that we'd have a little bit more attendance, because the real goal is to work with those that have participated to really get a feel for whether or not we need to create a watershed protection plan for Caney Creek. So that would be the next goal. And then finally, I'll wrap up with implementation that we've done in the past couple of years, but also, again, I would like to get a nice idea or sense of where you'd like to see us focus implementation going forward. We have numerous resources available, and we'd like to certainly be able to focus the resources that you'd like to see us bring to bear in the Caney Creek watershed. And we'll wrap up with next steps. The time on the side is probably irrelevant, just kind of a guidepost for us. If we finish early, that is always great. So of course, why are we here? You've seen this before, at least most of you. There are portions of the Caney Creek watershed that are impaired. There are two essential assessment units within that watershed that are red, and they're impaired for contact recreation. And we use fecal bacteria indicators to address those impairments. And I'll talk about those in just a bit. Just to walk through, this is Caney Creek title. That's the kind of teal colored. There are two assessment units. Assessment units are essentially a smaller portion of the segment that's assessed. In this case, there are 2 assessment units in the title, 130401 and 130402. Linnville Bayou is this brown, tan colored area. There are 3 assessment units in Linnville Bayou. Its segment listing is 1304A, which designates it as a unclassified segment to essentially the title segment. And then again, there's 01, which is the one that's impaired. There's one that's concerned, 1304, I'm sorry, not concerned, but that's actually 130402, that's the concerned one. There's a small, it's really tiny, you almost can't even see it, 1304A02 in Linnville Bayou as well, and then 1304A03. In the mustard colored area, there actually are 3 segments here. One of them is a standard segment 1305, but then you have 1305A, which is Hardeman Slough, and 1305B, which is just a watershed that flows into 1305. Those are 2 unclassified segments. 1305 above title Caney Creek is has 3 segments or assessment units itself. 130501, you're down near Cedar Lane. 130502, which is under a concern for contact recreation. 130503. When we move to those unclassified segments, 1305A, 01 and 02, both of those are considered fully supporting. And then we get up to 1305B, 01, that is under concern currently for contact recreation. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The status of projects in terms of where we're at, just look quick review of the meetings we've had so far. We've had 4 coordination committee meetings prior to this one being the 5th. On the first and second one, we're really kind of kickoff meetings where we tried to identify stakeholders and encourage those stakeholders to potentially participate going forward. I thank you, John, as a participant of that meeting number 2, and you've continued to constantly come to meetings as we've proceeded through these. I really appreciate that. Meeting 3, we focused on best management practices and management measures, and I asked the group to take a survey, and we then, in meeting 4, reviewed that survey results. This meeting, we're kind of backtracking a little bit to 4 and talking about those results, but really focused again on those management measures. And again, we'd hope to get a few more of the coordination committee members on. We'll continue to try to do that going forward and hopefully keep this process moving. The TMDL update for documents that are going into the TMDL program. Again, there are 2 documents that go into the EPA. Principally, there's a technical support document, which essentially characterizes the water body, gives all the kind of details that are then sort of summarized into a TMDL document itself, which is the I guess more the document that goes to the EPA for them to approve moving forward with reducing bacteria and to address the issue of impaired waters. It's a reporting process for the EPA in terms of what TCEQ sends to them, and that goes through the commission and then goes up to EPA. So that TMDL document needs to go there. So the technical support document, we submitted that back in 2018. We had comments that we addressed and resubmitted in August of 2019. And that's currently with TCEQ at the moment, going through the management process. The TMDL document we submitted back in July of 2019, addressed some comments and resubmitted in September, and that again is up with TCEQ as well through their management process. Once it makes it through there, at some point the commissioners would look at it and then put that out to the public for public review. And of course, I'll let you know that when that happens, and we'll have a meeting in the watershed to give you an opportunity to finally look at that document again and make comments. Let me point out on the right there is a sort of screenshot of the technical support document. It is currently available on the website at TCEQ. You can essentially just put in Caney Creek technical support document and search for it. The link is there as well on the slide. Finally, we have drafted an implementation plan that TCEQ had a chance to look at. It's just sort of a straw man for the implementation plan. As soon as we have the clearance, we'll submit that to you all to give you a chance to start really looking at the implementation plan. There is still room, a lot of room left for us to work on that plan, and again, the discussion tonight will help to fill out that plan in a little bit better sense. Most of you have seen this as well, and before, the table to the right is all those assessment units that I ran through on an earlier slide. Again, I mentioned there's a fecal indicator bacteria that goes to assessing whether the contact recreation standards are being met. For the tidal portion, that is enterococcus, and the standard is 35 colony forming units per 100 milliliter. Escherichia coli is for freshwater, so the freshwater assessment units, and it's 126 colony forming units per 100 milliliter. If you use that standard and you look at the geometric mean to the very far right of that table, you'll see just going down in case of the first two, those are enterococcus, so you'd measure 47.8, taking that first one, versus say 35, and there's not a whole lot of difference there. It's certainly less than, you know, 1.5 times the standard. And that's kind of the point of the graph to the left. If you look at most of those assessment units, certainly at the very tail end of that graph, looking 2017 to 2019, you're looking at most of those assessment units being roughly 1.5 times or less than the standard. It's important to note how close we are in those cases. If you look at the city of Houston and Harris County, where we have some bacteria implementation plan going on there, you typically are looking at more like 8-9 times the standard. That brings us back to that graph for at least segment 1305B, certainly elevated. And when we talk on the next slide about the integrated report, we'll talk about the number of samples and the challenge currently for being able to fully assess it, but it certainly is high. As we develop an implementation plan and implement measures, we're going to look at the whole watershed. So even though there's only 2 assessment units that we're actually addressing through the TMDL process, the implementation plan will actually cover this whole watershed, including all of these assessment units. So looking at the 2016 Texas Integrated Report, just the fecal bacteria portion of that report for Caney Creek, we see that in just looking at that column to the right, along with the geometric mean right next to it in terms of the status as well. And NS means non-support for the contact recreation standard. CN means concern for near non-attainment for the contact recreation standard. And if it has an FS, it means it's fully supporting. Now, these are the only assessment units where there's sufficient data to at least make some form of an assessment. In the case of that last one, 1305B01, that one that has a high geometric mean, there's only 6. And so while they made an assessment, there wasn't enough to fully assess it and give it a non-support at this time. Again, we will be addressing all of this through the implementation plan. Hitting a couple of the low duration curves. Again, these are just specifically for the impaired assessment units. Looking at 1304A01, that's the one that's in Linnville Bayou, right there near Sweeney. As you look at these low duration curves, a couple of points to think about. First, the x-axis there goes from 0 to 100. You're looking at the flows, with the highest flows rated at the 0, lowest flows you'll find at the 100 mark. So everything's sort of stacked in between the very highest and the very lowest. You're able then to kind of think about the x-axis as being a delineation of high flows to low flows, looking at the very highest flows going, in this case, from 0 to 10%, moist conditions 10 to 40%, mid-range conditions 40 to 60%, dry conditions 60 to 90%, and finally low flows. So essentially very wet weather to almost drought conditions through the graph. You'll see that first really light blue line here is the flow duration curve. The next line is the standard curve. Now the standard curve is essentially the standard, and in this case this is for fresh water, so it's 126. You multiply that 126 times the flow at whatever point it is on the graph, and you develop a standard curve. The next green line is the single sample standard, 399, and again, you multiply that through and get you the single sample standard. Then finally, we take the data points, and again, you multiply the data points times the flow at that date that it was collected, and you can then plot it in whether it's a high flow, moist condition, and so forth through this graph. So that single sample standard is on here so that you can kind of look at each of those sample points and compare it to what the single sample standard would be. And so in this case, you can see there are several samples that were collected that came in above the single sample standard. In most cases, at most load duration curves, you don't normally see that, but in this case we do. It's interesting also to note on here when we compare the load regression curve, the red line, to the standard line. In the case, the load regression curve is based on the geometric mean of the data. We're following that standard curve almost all the way to the end, and it might cross to this very far tail, and we'll see that as we look at the load reduction values in just a bit. Additionally, on here, you'll see a geomean load, which is essentially the geometric mean of the data points within each of these loading portions. And that's important as we get, again, to some of the later tables further on down. Another point while we're here, one of the goals when we talk about trying to meet the standard is trying to take essentially this red line and bring it down to the purple line or below. So then when we look at these points, we're going to try to bring this number, in this case 107 times 10 to the 12th, we want to bring that down to the standard curve here. And we'll use that when we start talking about the TMDL, the total maximum daily load value. So we do that again for 130401. Again, this is the title portion now down close to Sargent. Again, you have a similar process where we load the values of flow and we create those standard lines as well as the load regression curve. As you can see, this graph is different than the previous graph. We see that the load regression curve actually crosses over in the mid-range conditions. And I want to save this point to this graph just because it's a little bit clearer here. When we're looking at this from, again, wet weather to dry weather, one of the reasons we use load duration curves is to be able to kind of look at potential sources. So when you think of wet weather sources, you're looking at things that have fallen on the ground that might get picked up by rainfall events and then brought to the water body. So if we're thinking about that, certainly here at this point where we have high flows and moist conditions, where the load regression curve is higher than the standard by a good portion, we're thinking then that, there's probably a larger contribution from wet weather here in this case. As we move to dry conditions, we start shifting away from precipitation events to areas where we have drier intermittent periods. And in this case, we still have values, but they're certainly lower here. When we're thinking of dry conditions, and certainly in the low flow conditions, we're really typically thinking of point sources, things like wastewater treatment facilities and the like, as being contributors in this kind of area. And so it's good to note that we potentially don't have that here. Now, throughout these kinds of things in wet weather, dry weather, we often have contributions from, say, septic systems or on-site sewage facilities or sanitary sewer overflows that could be caused by either wet weather events, or they could be a chronic series of events in the case of a septic system that may be just chronically having a failure and contributing to the watershed. So we have to also be cognizant of the fact that some sources may come from both wet weather and dry weather at the same time. So again, if we took those points, these orange squares, we could look at reducing what's the difference between this square here and the purple, and say that's the load reduction value needed, and we do that and place that essentially on this table here. Again, looking at it from high flow conditions, we typically see the largest reduction needed. As we move down, it get closer to the standard. And in the case of, if you remember, just recall 130401, we actually cross over at the mid-range condition, and there at that point we don't need any additional reduction to meet the standard. if you recall 1304A01, we pretty much are above the standard throughout the curve, and therefore reduction needs to take place throughout the curve. Again, if we then focus primarily at this higher value, if we reduce the overall standard or the overall load at that point, we probably are going to correct for all of these other conditions too. So we typically see that when we look at a total maximum daily load, we use the value here at the high flow condition to set the total maximum daily load. So the TMDL was done. Again, we just focused on the TMDL for those two impaired AUs. We actually did calculations for the other AUs where we had sufficient data, and we'll be using that for the management measures, which we'll talk about in just a bit. But the TMDL requires us to focus on those impaired AUs, and so we focused on 130401 and 1304A01. And again, this is at the 5% mark in the high flow conditions. We took the central TMDL, which is a basis of where that curve is, standard curve is at the 5%. That's the value that you'll see there at 387.70 billion CFU per day, or in the case of E. coli, Enterococcus 387, or E. coli 268.66. Additionally, this could be calculated. We essentially back calculate out these other terms. They should all then add up to be the TMDL number. We'll calculate the waste load allocation for wastewater treatment facilities. That also includes a term for future growth. And when you look at the TMDL document for Caney Creek, you'll be able to see these calculations. There's a waste load allocation for stormwater. Now, while this watershed doesn't have municipal separate storm sewers, there are other permitted sources such as industry that you find in Sweeney. That's why in the case of 13.4A01, you see an amount for waste load allocations for stormwater. It also includes things like construction and that kind of thing that might happen that have permits with the TCEQ. And so there's a little bit in 130401. Finally, there's a load allocation that essentially addresses things like non-point source issues. This is just a sort of a bucket for what's left after you calculate out these other three factors. That final one is margin of safety, which essentially is a 0.05 of the TMDL number, just to give you a margin of safety for the watershed for all the things that we don't know. And we certainly don't know everything, and we're hoping stakeholders can help inform us on what we don't know. So we're about to shift gears. I want to give an opportunity for folks to ask any question at this point. I don't know if we have any questions yet. Andrea?
No one has raised their hands or typed any questions into the chat box, so looks like we're all good. If anyone needs any help, there should be a little red arrow at the top right of your screen. If it is expanded, then you'll see the chat and question box and the place to raise your hand. If it's not expanded, just click on the little red arrow and those boxes will appear.
Great, and I didn't necessarily expect to have any. As I said, a lot of this is old information for folks who have been participating for a while now. So we're going to shift gears now to the draft Caney Creek implementation plan. As I mentioned, we have a draft plan in with TCEQ. It was done to meet a deliverable deadline, but knowing that we were going to be needing the coordination committee and other watershed stakeholders to have some input to it, it is left fairly breezy in terms of the ability to come back and fix some things, and we knew that was going to happen. So what's in an implementation plan? A lot of the information is going to refer to the TMDL and technical support document for a lot of the technical details. So it'll be a summary, a brief summary of those two documents, but mostly it's going to be focused on the sources of fecal bacteria, as well as those management measures that need to be implemented to reduce those sources, as well as identifying partners that will be implementing those management measures and potential funding sources to carry out those management measures. As we step in, one of the difficulties is, well, what is the loading from each of these sources? How do we determine that loading? And then how do we actually try to estimate what types of reduction practices need to be implemented to reduce that load? So we looked at it. This has actually been done in other watersheds, and we didn't do specific modeling for Caney Creek. There's things like SELECT and other processes that have been done in other watersheds that could be done here, but we didn't have the funding to do that at this time. And so we looked at applying standards or values that are done in other watersheds to this watershed. So the first step was to begin with developing subwatersheds. In our case here, this watershed was fairly well broken down into subwatersheds based on assessment units. So we used those as a guide for creating subwatersheds. Now, an assessment unit is really just a linear portion of the water body. We had to essentially create the subwatershed that flows into that assessment unit. And we did that. And so you see there's 11 subwatersheds. And then again, they follow directly with relationship to the assessment units. So you'll find some large ones and some very tiny ones. Again, just based on delineation. And again, 9 is quite small, 1304A02, very tiny as well. The next step is then to calculate or estimate source loads, and how we went about doing that. If you have time to read the technical support document, you'll note that we made estimates for on-site sewage facilities, we made estimates for cattle and the like. So there are estimate numbers given to the watershed. We then applied those in a proportion based on, in case of cattle, the amount of pasture that's available in those watersheds or subwatersheds in this point, and then applied those numbers to those subwatersheds to try to based on a percentage basis. The next part is then how do we reach a load value? So again, as I mentioned, there's been some work done in other watersheds where there's an understanding of what a representative unit is for these things, in case of a failing on-site sewage facility or a standard for sanitary sewer flows or 1 cal or whatnot. What's a representative unit load per day given each of these units? And so then you just take that number and you multiply it through by the estimate of population size or number of on-site sewage facilities or whatnot to get an estimated load for a given representative unit. And so we applied that and developed both a total across for each subwatershed, or you can look at it by going down by source for the entire Caney Creek watershed, as well as a load per acre. And so one of the things you'll note is that the load per acre were fairly reasonable in size in comparison, but certainly the totals contributing is a little bit different just because the watershed size is different per each of these subwatersheds. And we'll use these totals going across to then back source out the actual load reduction needed. And that's the next step. But this table was used to create those maps that you'll see in just a minute, those priority maps, much like that first one here, where we looked at all sources. Again, we used a high, medium, low process. So we kind of look for breakpoints that might say this is a high value for the subwatershed, and then a breakpoint to group those in a medium, and then another breakpoint to group those in a low. So I mentioned the need to then figure out how much reduction do we need by source. So the way we did that, or way we got to that, was we first looked at the percent value. So the percent, say for instance, of how much dogs contributed to the subwatershed. So what's this percentage of this load that, this total load that comes from dogs? So you take that percentage then and apply it back to slide 10. I'll just drop back to that real quick. Slide 10. 64. So this is that value, this is the total load reduction that's needed here in 130401. So we'll use that percentage, that sub-watershed value, in this case of dogs, we'll use the percentage this makes up to look at the percentage that load reduction across in each of these sub-watersheds. The challenge being that we do not have information to do that for each of these. So in some cases, in the case of sub-watersheds 1, 2, and 3, we have an assessment unit monitoring station that we had sufficient data here at sub-watershed 3. We had to then look at the percentage each of these sub-watersheds makes into that load reduction value. So that step was done prior to segregating or across the board percentage of, say, dog or feral hog or whatnot to get to or arrive at the value for each of these contributing to each sub-watershed. So once we have a value for each of these of a load reduction by source, we could then calculate out the number of units that we would have to address in each sub-watershed to meet the standard. And we'll talk about that as we move into management measures next. So I mentioned that back in July of 2019, we did a management measure questionnaire with the coordination committee. In that questionnaire, we had several high-level topics. In each of these topic areas, we also had individual activities that could be carried out, and those were also scored as well by the stakeholders that were there at that meeting. We asked those in that questionnaire, is it a watershed concern? And so in the case of domesticated animals representing ag producing sources, yes, and then moving on down the list, manure application and pet waste were considered not really to be a concern for the watershed. Based on the aggregate scores and then average score, based on the number of responses we received, we then have scores that range from almost 5 down to 1. And so when we were asking folks to score it, we asked them to score it on a high, medium, low, high being a 5, medium being a 3, and 1 being a low priority or low value. And so then by average score weighting, we're not going to be at a 5 for any of these, but we're also not going to be at 1. We then turn those high scores into a priority score with the highest average score being at a 1. So if it averaged out to be 5, it would be a top priority. If it averaged out to be a 4, it would receive essentially a medium or medium high priority, which was in this case a 2. If it averaged out to be a 3, it would be a medium priority at 3. And then at it gets lower priority as you get down the line here, with 2 essentially being a 4, average 1.6 up to 4 as well, and then 5 finally. So that just based on these sources and priorities, we fell on essentially 5 management measures. And again, a lot of these, wouldn't be out of the norm of any of these watershed protection plans or implementation plans. These are typically what you'll find. In the case of management measure 1, again, their top priority, addressing land management, agricultural sources, and that kind of thing. On-site sewage facilities, septic systems, their use and maintenance as a number 2 priority, addressing feral hogs, 3, wastewater treatment facilities and collection system, 4, and then finally reduce stormwater sources. That one sort of being a catch-all for last. And again, if you looked at the TMDL equation, there is a stormwater sources as well. And so it in some ways covers some other sources. And we'll get to that section. We'll talk about some of those various catch-alls that fall in there. So looking at support land management initiatives, again, looking at cattle, horses, and goats. Now there are other things that can fall under land management initiatives. This is the data-driven part, is the fact that we have some data related to cattle, horses, and goats. But there might be some other things that fit in here as well that we could look at applying in this management measure. So we have, again, values for cattle, sheep, goats, and horses. We again looked at it from both the loading side in terms of how many cattle, sheep, goats, and horses fit in each of these sub-watersheds. Then we also looked at it by turning it around and going down the load reduction side to look at how many need to be reduced potentially in a given watershed. One point to note here is we're not advocating removing 317 horses, sheep, goats, cattle from subwatershed 1. We are actually recommending, and we worked through with NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and a Texas State Soil Water Conservation Board on their conservation management plans and water quality management plans, looking at how many livestock would be addressed by a particular management plan. And a general rule of thumb for them is 50. And so if you're looking at a management plan that addresses 50, that would be how you would arrive then at the number of livestock you're addressing and how many plans you would use to create to address those. And when we talk about livestock management plans, we're talking about things like fencing to fence off the watershed, the water body from cattle direct deposits. You're looking at alternative water sources. So you removed that water source by fencing. What are some alternative water sources to help the landowner and the cattle obviously have water to drink? You're looking at maintaining filter strips, green riparian zones to help also provide additional removal of any bacteria or sediments or those kinds of things. So that's part of what goes in a total in a plan that you create for this. So in the implementation plan, there are typically charts, and there will be a chart that includes all the different parts of the each management measure. It probably won't look like this. It's going to be changed a little bit. This is sort of a fun look at and a simple look at what would go in management measure 1. So just to walk you through it, so what's the objective of support land management initiatives? Increase the number of water quality management plans, conservation management plans, and created, protected, and or enhanced riparian buffers while maintaining or increasing the yields of local agricultural producers and landowners. So again, we're not seeking to affect economic production, that kind of thing. We're looking at ways to maybe even enhance it. I know there's been, Brian Koch has mentioned at least one of the meetings that some of the yield has increased by doing some of these measures. And so we can look at hosting technical workshops and those kinds of things to help maybe encourage or incentivize the use of these types of management measures. Again, there's a load reduction value that comes from those previous charts. We have high priority areas. Again, we looked at that. So what kind of activities? Again, we talked about water quality management plans, conservation management plans, riparian buffers, and again, workshops is the primary activities that would be carried out through this management measure. Part of it's developing a schedule. What would you do? So in the case of 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, those would probably be coming after you spent some time working with the local producers, local authorities through workshops and those kinds of things. So we're thinking in years 3, 4, and 5, and start wanting to maybe implement some of these plans. In this case, 3 water quality management plans within the first 5 years would be a goal for that. How did we arrive at the numbers for implementation cost? So water quality management plans, there's a $15,000 cap from the Texas State Soil Water Conservation Board, but also requires the local landowner to put up some money with that. And so we get roughly the $20,000 or so to start with. for one water quality management plan. Conservation management plans can be a lot larger than that. And of course, the cost of a riparian buffer project could be substantially more than that. Again, these are just target figures. They're certainly not in any way perfect, just based on some professional knowledge and some previous plans that have been produced before. So task or activity 1.4, again, that's the workshops. So it would be focused primarily in this first few years to really have those workshops covering these topic areas to help encourage their use and implementation further down the road as we go forward. And then finally, a 1 year a report in year 5 that would cover how successful we were at implementing this management measure and so forth. So responsible parties, again, these are those that were identified. There are others. This is certainly not limited to just the ones that have been identified here. There could be others that could participate, just trying to identify those that either have funding that could be pushed towards this management measure, or those with a technical expertise to carry it out, or those that would be the landowner, drainage district, or local government that might actually implement it on their land. Performance measures strictly looks at how you would gauge success, whether it's based on the number of water quality management plans, conservation management plans, riparian buffers that were put in place, or acreage is held in the case of buffers, and then the number of technical outreach. So it's really programmatic measures in this case. Monitoring, again, you'd have a programmatic value. Did we accomplish the numbers we expected? And then there's environmental measures where you look at the water quality data and see if anything's improved. So in here, there's a watershed coordinator. Typically, when you're carrying out an implementation plan or a watershed protection plan, there's a watershed coordinator that's been identified that helps to coordinate the funding and helps to coordinate implementation, and on the backside, kind of report on how we're doing. And then Clean Rivers Program, CRP, is the program. H-GAC is a sponsor along with TCEQ in this region, collects the environmental data, and the data that we use to identify the impairments in the first place would then be used to try to determine if we're seeing any improvement. Just to let you know, I won't go through all of them like this unless you want me to. But again, this is really where we like to see feedback on, whether it's at this meeting or it's at your time. And one of the things that we didn't mention was we really want to we'll put the slides up for y'all to look at so that we can get some feedback on it as well. Because this is where we really like to make sure it's tailored to Caney Creek and the watershed stakeholders, because you're the ones to implement this. On-site sewage facility use and maintenance. Again, we looked at load reduction values for each sub-watershed and then estimated the units to address. Again, it's based on a loading reduction value. And so in this case, we ended up with 9. So you look on the table down there at the bottom of the screen, there's a couple of zeros and then we sort of rounded up to 9. If you were to look into where those zeros are, there's actually on-site sewage facilities there. It just didn't reach the level of 0. And one of the areas where I have to fix will be to make sure that the counting works out for that. The main point, though, is 9 is a very low number. We have about 3,844 on-site sewage facilities in the Linnville, Bayou, Caney Creek watershed, both those that are permitted as well as those that we estimated are either grandfathered or unpermitted in there. And based on estimates of the numbers that are failing, about 461 of those are failing. So 9 is obviously very small compared to the 461 estimated failing. But that is how much has been estimated if we were to do this along with the other management measures, we would see improvement to the point that we hopefully meet the standard. That being said, there are other areas that may be more difficult to address than to address on-site sewage facilities. So having a small number here, while we might be able to reach fairly easily, we could go more than the 9 and help other management areas reach their goal too. Additionally, a point needs to be made. I didn't make it on the previous one because it's easier to see here. This is essentially if we were to do 9, do everything else and hold the numbers going forward. So we're saying in this case, we repair or replace 9 so they're fully functioning. The rest that were already failing can remain failing, but all those rests that are currently performing perfectly still need to remain perfect in terms of their functioning. And so you'd have to hold that throughout the period of time until we meet the standard. And so that in that case, there is certainly the likelihood that that's not going to happen. More are going to be failing, or more, the opportunities for those to fix those that are failing. So that would change. And so the 9 is just a target. It would be clear for us to want to do more than just 9, just even from that point of view. And so here's the at a glance for management measure 2. Again, I'll point out just the activities here focused on technical outreach and workshops to reach those owners of the on-site sewage facility, and then to have inspection, repair, replace, or abandon. And again, that's limited in some cases where you might actually abandon an on-site sewage facility over into a collection system for a wastewater treatment facility in some cases. That's certainly been done in other areas, other watersheds. It could be done here, but it's limited based on funding and obviously having a certain density of systems to be able to do so. I know in Sargent that was done there in terms of hooking up to the Caney Creek wastewater treatment facility there. So I mean, it can be done. But we're not going to focus most of our energy there, but more on the inspection, repair, and replace. So in this case, we have programs. H-GAC has one. I know Texas AgriLife is doing another to work on providing the outreach, as well as work on funding, trying to find funding to do the inspection, repair, and replace here. Generally, the systems cost anywhere from about $5,000 to $10,000 to repair and replace. So average cost there, times 9 is at least a fair number of almost $1 million. So we know per year we could certainly easily, if we can find the funding, be addressing those. Workshops, again, are the first priority, and then working with homeowners that are interested, beginning to look at repairing and replace those going forward. I'll leave this up for a couple more minutes for y'all to look at before moving forward. All right, let's proceed on to management measure 3. Address fecal deposition by feral hog populations. Again, we arrive at feral hog load reduction value. We then look at it from a represented daily unit load. And in this case, we are talking about actual removal from the watershed. For those of you, and I know Parks and Wildlife is on here, 21, 22 feral hogs removed. And again, keeping the population steady after you remove those feral hogs, that's not going to happen. So we know that that's a low number. And again, here's an area where we could certainly remove more. I know studies say 50 to 70% of the population removal every year just to maintain the population level. If those are accurate, then obviously that's quite a bit more than the 21, 22, because we have ranges anywhere from about 40 on up to about 200 in each of the segmented watersheds, not the sub watersheds, but in the larger segment of each watershed. So there's certainly more than the 21, 22 that would need to be removed. Again, this is an opportunity like the on-site sewage facilities to do more to address maybe areas where it's a little bit more difficult. Thinking of doing those water quality management plans with ag producers, or the stormwater quality, or even wastewater sanitary sewer overflows, as we move and look at those management measures next. So here under management measure 3, 2 activities, voluntary feral hog reduction measures. So this would be looking at landowners, coordinating with them on ways to reduce those feral hogs on their properties. Could be local governments too, as well. And then also providing feral hog outreach, working with landowners on the latest techniques to remove feral hogs from the watershed. So that'd be the main focus here. Again, a lot of it's driven by either a workshop or in a case of a campaign. I know I've mentioned it before at previous meetings that there are certainly some counties in the Plum Creek watershed where they actually provide some funding for per head removal, and so you could get reap some benefits if the county was interested in offering a programs like that. Again, I'll leave this up for a moment or two. All right, moving on to management measure 4, maintain and improve wastewater treatment facility and collection system function. So when we were looking at prioritizing in this watershed, you'll want to note that there are essentially 3 wastewater treatment facilities that outfall directly to the watershed, and there is another one. So there's one up in the bowling area in subwatershed 1. There's 2 in subwatershed 5 near Van Fleck, and then those are the ones that outfall to the watershed, not including the ones in the Old Ocean area or the Phillips 66 plant, because those certainly have there's certainly outfalls in Linnville Bayou there, but they're not considered wastewater treatment facilities supplying bacteria in this case. In 11, there's the Caney Creek wastewater treatment facility. It outfalls actually into the Intercoastal Waterway, but it's included here because their collection system is in the watershed. And so there's the opportunity for sanitary sewer overflows, and the wastewater treatment facility itself is actually in the watershed too. So when we're talking about wastewater as a potential source, we're talking about both its allowable limit for fecal bacteria and the volume that's contributed. But we're also talking about anything where they might have an upset that then takes them over their permit level. And then also we're looking at sanitary sewer overflows in the collection system going to those wastewater treatment facilities. The data when we looked at the wastewater treatment facilities is there's very few upsets or exceedances to the limits. We also only found 1 sanitary sewer overflow reported for those 4 wastewater treatment facilities. I say that because we did look at the sanitary sewer overflows for the Caney Creek wastewater treatment facility in 11, and there's only 1 that came from that Caney Creek wastewater treatment facility. I think it was way back in 2012. So there wasn't a whole lot to go on for sanitary sewer overflows. So the high, medium, low that you see in that map to the left is really based on the number of wastewater treatment facilities. So there's 2 in 5, there's 1 up in 1, and there's just the collection system in 11, and so we just based it on that priority. We could maybe look at some things differently. I didn't mention it when we talked about the TMDL. I might have mentioned there's a future growth component or not, but just in case I didn't, we do look at how growth will happen with the population, factor that in to the TMDL calculation in terms of infrastructure needed for wastewater treatment facilities. And we did estimate or provide for a wastewater treatment facility to be placed in the Linnville Bayou Watershed down the road in the future. Certainly as growth from population comes feeding down into Missouri County from the direction of Houston, there's an opportunity for growth maybe to happen in that watershed. And so we wanted to put at least a future wastewater plant just in case that happened. So that was calculated in to the TMDL. So looking at how you would improve the sanitary sewer collection system and wastewater treatment facilities and maintain them. Again, a lot of it's to identify wastewater treatment facilities with chronic problems. There really aren't those, but we can provide technical assistance. I know at least one of the wastewater treatment facilities is for a mobile home park in the Van Fleck area. So there's opportunities for technical assistance if needed. We can certainly provide that. Identify areas where collection system I&I or aging infrastructure a problem? Again, data doesn't necessarily support that there's that need, but we certainly can work with those permit holders to see if there's opportunities that they'd like to try to apply there, and reach out to them. The other side of it is providing fat, soil, and grease fog information to utility customers, working through the permit holders and their customers to get that information out to ensure that we don't have sanitary sewer overflows in the future. So then I'll leave this up for a little bit for y'all to review. There's a lot more information on here. And so most of this is programmatic. If you look at implementation costs, certainly didn't factor in any major repairs, upgrades to a wastewater treatment facility. Population was to grow by a lot. If you needed to make that facility larger, that kind of thing is certainly going to cost a lot more than what we currently identify here. All right, moving into management measure 5, reduce stormwater sources. This is where we use the pet waste load. And again, there's not a lot of other data to talk about stormwater sources other than pet waste. And again, pets in this area, there's population size of these towns and whatnot are not very large. This is also why this is considered the lowest priority, but there's still opportunities here. If you look at the pet waste load reduction and the representative load per day, we're talking about 108. Again, we're not talking about removing 108, 109 dogs from the watershed. We're actually talking about removing 108, 109 instances of pets evacuating their bowels, essentially pet pooping. So taking those essentially out of the system and removing them from the area. So just letting you know that's where we're at with this one. I'm not sure that we have any other data sources to use. Again, we're looking at high, medium, low, which is looking at the map. There's not a lot of density even in those high areas. That's just the way both the way the document process works in terms of spreading out the pets across the watershed and where population size is. So even though there might be a larger population towards Wharton and Bowling, it spreads out into or evenly distributes across the watershed. So it looks like it seems larger maybe than it is. So then we're looking at management measure 5 and the activities here: pet waste station installation, delivering pet waste management education and outreach. And then finally 5.3, if you remember our survey, concerns for illegal dumping and the like would fall here under this addressing stormwater and illegal dumping. Again, there's some tie-ins to riparian areas, opportunities for, say, Van Fleck or Bowling to maybe do some of the green infrastructure, stormwater controls. Again, they're not an MS4 management, municipal separate storm sewer system permit holder. So there's opportunities if you were to find 319 funding or some other funding to potentially maybe do some more of these green infrastructure, low impact development type projects there. Again, they're not a large population there, so it may not be of interest, but there's a potential there to do that outside of just the pet waste that we're talking about primarily under this management measure. One of the things we have here at H-GAC is the solid waste program. So illegal dump sites, some of that information could be used to help target areas for removing some of these illegal dump sites. There's also camera programs, that kind of thing, to help identify illegal dumping and find a person who's doing it and have essentially a actual trail of information that could be used for a court case. So there's some opportunities here outside, again, as I mentioned, pet waste. All right, we're about to shift to slide 30. So here in slide 30, I really want to, again, there's an opportunity for feedback. If it doesn't happen here, we'll try to get this out to all the coordination committee members to give them an opportunity to provide feedback. We really want to know if one, are you in agreement with these 5 management measures? Is there something that we missed? Because certainly it's easy for us. You know, I live over here in Stafford, Texas. I don't live in Caney Creek to not know that watershed that well. And so if there's something I missed, we certainly want to address that. You know, do these management measures meet your expectations? Is there something, again, did we miss? Is the priority correct? Is management measure 1 the top priority? Is reducing stormwater sources the least priority? How do the individual tasks or activities that were under each of these management measures, do they fit? Is there, again, a task or activity that we missed that could be applied here? Because again, those that live in this watershed are the ones we're asking to implement. Whether you're a local government, you're ag producer, you have your on-site sewage facility, or the like, we're asking you to potentially implement these. Do they fit with what your expectation is? Would you implement them yourselves? Are we missing something? And when you look at it, what about the assigned parties? Is there somebody on there that maybe is missing that should be on there? John, you're from also the East Matagorda Bay Foundation. Do you all want to be listed in these management measures as a participant? I certainly would love to have you. Or from the Caney Creek Estates, you see a role to play there. We'd love to have that recognized if need be. Costs, if you have any information on costs, again, we picked those costs from similar other documents that were produced. But if you had any information, we certainly would love to see that or hear from you on that. Any questions or comments? We're going to shift into watershed protection plan discussion next, but certainly would like to see if there's anything you all have to add to this.
Stephen, for a moment now, I can unmute everyone, and if anyone has any questions, they can just ask them. I would just ask that everybody not talk at once because it'll be difficult to hear anyone if that happens. So let's try to unmute everybody and see if we have any questions.
All right, let's move into the watershed protection plan discussion. So we started talking about addressing bacteria in Caney Creek watershed. We mentioned that we were going to be doing an implementation plan.
Stephen,
yes.
I'm sorry, I'd like to interrupt. The unmute maybe didn't work, but Mr. McLaughlin had a question to concentrate on OSSF, maybe, or
Okay.
OSSF.
So is it a priority to focus on on-site sewage facilities? Is that the question? Or is it a comment?
He said yes, it's a question.
So as a question, you know, I don't really see there being that much difference between the priority of management measure 1 or management measure 2. They were both, you know, one was I think 4.7, the other one was like a 4.4. I would think that both of those would be, if I was to say where we're going to focus priority wise, you would address those two at the same time. We do have a lot of area that's under land management, ag producing. So certainly that initiative, again, we're not setting the bar real high with, I think it was 10, 9 or 10. Make sure I got that correct. I don't want to say that. 33. I'm sorry, it's a fair amount, but in terms of management plans, but so focusing on both of those, I think, is certainly the best. If I was to say where we want to put our funding, that would be it.
And I do apologize for the technical difficulties. Everybody is unmuted now if they'd like to be.
Any other questions? All right, let's move into the watershed protection plan. Anybody have a question? If you look at the map on the right of the slide, you'll note that there are a fair number of TMDLs as well as a fair number of watershed protection plans. There's actually 10 TMDLs and 11 watershed protection plans in the H-GAC planning region, which is a shaded area covering those counties around Galveston Bay. So about 50-50 in terms of the number. If you look down at the Linnville Caney Creek watershed, it's currently listed as a TMDL. We do have to create an implementation plan to address the total maximum daily load, process. And so that will be done. But we really also need to decide, do we need to create a watershed protection plan? And I'm hoping to get some feedback from y'all on that. Again, I understand that we don't have all the coordination committee, and so I'm going to be reaching out to each individual coordinating committee member to work with them on this issue. To let you know, common watershed-based plan concerns, and this is for both total maximum daily load implementation plans as well as watershed protection plans. Concerns include things like who's going to be the watershed coordinator, what organization is going to maintain the implementation plan, ensure that it's being implemented, ensure that funding's coming, and that local partners are implementing it. That's always been a concern for these plans. Funding for implementation, again, a lot of the dollars that have been used in the past are starting to dry up a little bit. A lot of those funding sources aren't available. So where's funding going to come from has always been a challenge. The local support and action, again, those partners in that watershed, finding the support as well as the actual action of implementation is a challenge. And on top of that, if you're a rural watershed, there's likely even fewer incentives and less funding available to implement the plan. So one of the reasons to create a watershed protection plan is that there is the potential for 319 funding. The 319 sources of funds from the EPA go to the state, TCEQ, as well as the Texas State Soil Water Conservation Board, split that 50-50. The Conservation Board focuses mostly on those agricultural sources. TCEQ focuses more on the wastewater sources to address, and they're available primarily to those who have a watershed protection plan or want to develop a watershed protection plan. So it's limited in terms of its use unless you have a watershed protection plan. Additionally, a reason to create a watershed protection plan in Caney Creek would be that there's the San Bernard watershed protection, that area right next to Caney Creek and Linnville Bayou. There's a plan already been created, and if we were to be awarded funding for the San Bernard, we would likely be awarded funding, and I'm just saying in general, awarded to an entity. You'd be likely to want to implement in the Caney Creek watershed as well if you had a watershed protection plan there too. In addition, you might want to create a watershed protection plan because you have concerns for the other water quality issues. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. What are the other water quality issues found in the Caney Creek Linnville Bayou watershed? Reasons potentially to not develop a watershed protection plan. One of those is that in developing an implementation plan, again, we have to create one anyway. The measures that you're implementing in that implementation plan oftentimes will address those other water quality issues. Secondarily, the San Bernard Watershed Protection Plan has been in place for about 4 years, And we have not been successful in, I'm saying H-GAC has not been successful in being, in getting a 319 funded project there. That's not to say implementation hasn't happened. I know Texas AgriLife is working with Friends of the River on outreach and education for their on-site sewage facilities. So work is being done, and when we have funds here at H-GAC that can be applied there, we do try to apply them there. But that's just to say that at least in terms of 319, we have not been successful. Trace Palacios implementation plan and watershed protection plan, which was I think finalized last year. They are in implementation and have already extended some work that they're doing over into the Caney Creek watershed related to agriculture. So there's a agricultural coordinator that's being funded from the Texas State Soil Water Conservation Board, and that coordinator as an extension agent is also working in Caney Creek too. So that's already happening now. So that could be a reason for not doing a watershed protection plan. H-GAC again will seek to apply funding opportunities when and where available on a regional approach. So we would likely be working in this watershed since it fits within our region when we have the opportunities to do so. And then finally, as I mentioned, we will have to address other water quality concerns if you were to do a watershed protection plan, and you may not want to mix that requirement into your current process. You just want to focus on fecal bacteria, and that's it. So those are some of the reasons for and against doing a watershed protection plan. Again, the real question is, do we need one? Do you feel the implementation plan is sufficient to cover it? Again, I'd like to get feedback on that if you have some thoughts on that. Here's the other water quality concerns for Caney Creek. They're all related to aquatic life in terms of their issues, whether it's dissolved oxygen available to aquatic life, nutrient loads, whether it's phosphorus. I guess phosphorus is the principal nutrient here that's a concern. Chlorophyll A, which could be related to, again, to the phosphorus loading, and both of those may be a factor in the dissolved oxygen. And then finally, habitat. Habitat's a little bit broader in terms of how they calculate habitat, so it could be related to structure of the bed sediments, could be related to habitat riparian along the corridor, so that could be a little bit broader than just the nutrients, but again, it's related to the aquatic life there in Caney Creek. So you would have to look at addressing this in the future watershed protection plan if that's the way folks want to go. So it's important to think about that too. Likewise, as I mentioned, if you were to work on riparian corridors to address bacteria, you would be addressing this. If you can prevent sediments from reaching the water body or fertilizer and those kinds of things, or you might help prevent this. If you're having sewage upsets, or cow or their waste is getting into the water body, you might be affecting this. So if you can prevent that, you could help maybe improve this situation too. Questions or comments on this?
Everyone is unmuted or can unmute themselves if they have any questions.
All right, we're about to wrap up here. We have just one more segment left to go through in this presentation that covers implementation. I've been talking a little bit about implementation. I mentioned Texas AgriLife working on-site sewage facility education. I also mentioned briefly H-GAC's program to address sanitary sewer, not sanitary sewer, but on-site sewage facilities as well. So we're constantly looking for opportunities. Back in 2019, we did offer
Stephen?
Texas. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, Mr. McLaughlin typed in questions. It says samples need to be more current.
Okay, so just to answer that, this Clean Rivers program collects data on a quarterly basis, and so I think the last time we have data is all the way through November, December of 2019. We do look at that data too, and I know that TCEQ in their integrated reports has actually already started the 2020 and the 2018 integrated report, which covers data through 2016, is available on their website now. So it's constantly being added to, and we do look at that data every year when we have the opportunity to. And so as we are looking at the implementation plan, as far as I'm aware of, there hasn't been any changes to the listing. And Jason, feel free to step in on 2020, because I don't remember what we have with related to Caney Creek, any changes. And the 2020 goes through the 2018 data period.
Right. I think in the 2020 there may be an additional AU, but we'll address that in the future. That one hasn't been accepted and won't be for some time from EPA, but through 2018 it has stayed the same.
Okay. So in that case, as Jason was mentioning, when we have the TMDL and it's completed, there is a process for updating through Water Quality Management Plan program, if I got that correct, that if a new AU comes online and the TMDL comes online, it's added into the process. Did that answer your question, John? So as I mentioned, we have the Texas Stream Team training we've done in Lake Jackson. We've done an on-site sewage facility workshop in Lake Jackson as well at Brazosport College. We've installed pet waste stations in the area, 7 in Bay City, 6 in Sweeney, 5 in Jones Creek, and 1 in Palacios. There's opportunities in Van Fleck, in Bowling. We could probably look at doing pet waste stations there as well. So going forward, we certainly would like to have some stakeholder influence on what types of programs. Obviously, we'd be looking at on-site sewage facilities as a target audience for our workshops, as well as addressing through our on-site sewage facility repair and replace program. So we've been doing that, as I mentioned already. We have a supplemental environmental project with TCEQ that allows us to look at moderately income folks in terms of their on-site sewage facilities and correct them if need be, or in some cases, actual full-on replacement. If you look at the table, Brazoria County, we've done essentially 6 in the Brazoria County watershed, Brazoria County itself, 3 replacement, 3 repair. We do still have 8 on our waiting list, and again, these things may have changed a little bit. This is probably a 2-month-old, 3-month-old slide. Matagorda County as well, we've done 2 replacements. We actually have 1 being replaced tomorrow, and I'll show you pictures of that in just a second. So we are working on on-site sewage facilities when and where we have funding, and right now we have 29 on a waiting list, and we currently don't have any funding to address those. 29 times about $10,000, it's almost $300,000 there just to address those that are on the wait list. Again, this is on-site sewage facility repair that we're doing right now. It'll be actually repaired tomorrow. They're pumping it out and trying to figure out what needs to be done to repair it. So again, this is the type of thing that we're trying to address in the watershed. So I always like to leave folks with a success story. I've traditionally used the BIG and the bacteria implementation group in the Houston regions graph that shows the down of the graph in terms of the trend for geometric means in the whole project area. In this case, since it's a little more germane to the area in terms of on-site sewage facilities, the Aldine Westfield case study is a coordinated partner effort of Harris County and the East Aldine Management District. There are 2 monitoring sites that we're looking at along Halls Bayou that are just downstream. In this case, Halls Bayou and Greens Bayou. So this is Halls Bayou and this is Greens Bayou. So looking at these stations, we could evaluate how the study went forward in terms of its environmental monitoring data. So as an example here, It's a place that's just located south of Beltway 8 North, so close to Bush Intercontinental Airport in Harris County. Since 2014, they've connected 811 residential and commercial properties to centralized wastewater. They've abandoned 1,413 on-site sewage facilities. Now, not all of these on-site sewage facilities were failing, but in the area, they did a study in the early or late 90s that determined 30 to almost 50% failure rates in some of the communities in this area. And so certainly a fair amount of those 1,400 that were abandoned were probably failing. Using 443 million community block grant dollars, along with $43 million that came from community block grants, Texas Water Development Board state revolving fund grants, and local bonds, they were able to essentially address these failing systems as well as other on-site sewage facilities. The, I guess, nugget of success is that those downstream stations, we saw a 20% reduction in bacteria at those stations. And this is for a period between 2013 and 2017. So, you know, with a little bit of work and a larger portion of money, some of these situations can be addressed and improved. And so with that, I want to thank you for your time this evening and for handling the webinar. Again, I will work to reach out to those coordination committee members that could not attend for whatever reason, and share this information with them as well. I think, Andrea, you mentioned, I don't know if we did accomplish the idea of recording. I probably should have said we were recording this if we were, and failed to note that. But if we did, then we'll share the link with those coordination committee members so that they could follow along with this program.
There was a little red light on the whole time, which indicates that it was recording. A little red light on my side. No one else could see it. So fingers crossed that actually worked.
And if there are any concerns, since I didn't mention this at the beginning, if there's any concerns with y'all on having this available, then let me know and we won't share it. Again, I didn't hear too many questions or any concerns that maybe those questions of what was stated. So certainly if there are any, let me know. Certainly if I said anything that's of concern, Jason, let me know that you guys wouldn't want to have out there. I'd certainly be able to address that.
Mr. McLaughlin had another question.
Sure.
During the time when you guys were talking about the samples, but also he wanted to know how many people are online with us. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of us, counting me and Stephen. I'm on there twice, but I'm not counting myself twice. And the other question that he had when you guys were talking about samples was that the chart showed 07-14. That might be something other people might be interested in hearing about as well.
So which chart was that one? I'm trying to follow which question or which chart.
He said go back.
No, I was wondering which chart or what I should share with folks. I missed it.
There was a chart when you guys were talking about the samples that need to be more current, and he said that the chart showed 07-14. So when you guys were talking about some numbers, that maybe the chart didn't match what exactly you were talking about, possibly.
Okay, so I think I know which table. We have two tables in here talking about data, and we'll go to those two, and maybe I can clear this up. So this one that has data through 2018, I believe, that one is actually the Clean Rivers program. It's also the Texas standard water quality standards information system data through 2018. So this is essentially the period of record of the data that we were using that goes into this chart here. So this is not the official integrated report to which the TMDL assessment is applied to. This is the data that just, it goes forward past that. Now, the 2020 integrated report will cover a 7-year period that ends in 2018, but it also began, I think, 2013, if I'm correct on that number. So we presented this here so that you have the full record of data, at least that we had used in the technical support document. And again, we try to keep adding data as we go forward. But a lot of that doesn't necessarily change the direction of the trend. Again, I think we're still probably looking at probably being in the same place as we add more data, but we'll continue to do that going forward. So then when you look at the integrated report, again, this was the period report that was available when we were doing the technical support document. 2018 draft was finalized this year. And again, 2020, they're currently working on as a draft. Will probably be either done in the fall or just slightly later into 2021. Again, that'll cover data all the way through 2018.
Steve, so can I break in?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just mention that for the TMDL document itself, we have included the 2018 draft, which includes data through 2016. We try to have the most recently approved by EPA 303D list information in our TMDL. So since we did the TSD, an additional one, the 2018 one was completed, and we'll be using that for the TMDL MDI plan.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So yeah, we'll keep adding as we can, but for the purposes of the TMDL, again, they have to use the assessment that's done and completed and the latest one, and so we'll continue to work off of whatever one that is for the actual addressing the total maximum daily load process. Good question. Are there any others? All right, well then I'd like to thank you all for attending and getting us through at least this first attempt at a webinar. And as I said, I will check in with the other coordination committee members and see how we can best get them up to speed. I don't want to wait until we're allowed to have a actual in-person meeting. Again, we're all trying to work through either the concerns through our agency or the concerns through federal government or whatever about meeting at meetings. And so we'll deal with what we can deal with and do our best. Again, John, and for those stakeholders, if you've got any thoughts on those management measures, again, I'll make this presentation both available through our website, but I will also send it out to the stakeholders so they have it available to them to review. You come up with things that are important for you to let me know, and I'll be happy to talk with you through those or find out what we can do to address any concerns or thoughts or needs to make this implementation plan a success. And so with that, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome. You want to close this out, Andrea?
Yes. Yes, I would like to talk to you after, but it doesn't have to involve everybody else. So maybe I'll just give you a call, or we can talk at the office tomorrow.
Sure.